We would like to send out a special thanks to our sponsor, Wink, for supporting The Trail Went Cold. Wink is offering our audience members who are over 21 and live in the US a $20 credit, plus free shipping on their first order of 4 bottles of wine as a new member of Wink. So please visit trywink.com/cold. That's trywinc.com/cold. Thank you, and enjoy the show. May 5th, 1996. Tijuana, Mexico. A young man is struck by a motorcycle while running across the highway and dies in hospital 6 days later. 3 weeks pass before he is identified as Patrick Sean Kelly, a 22-year-old Canadian film student who had gone missing from the University of Southern California. A numerous amount of suspicious discrepancies suggest there is more to Patrick's death than a simple accident, as his ATM card and vehicle are used after he is hospitalized. The evidence also shows that Patrick likely traveled to Mexico with an unidentified person, but the reasons for his trip, as well as the actual circumstances of how he was killed, remain unclear. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today I will be profiling a rather lesser-known case which was featured on Unsolved Mysteries, the 1996 death of Patrick Sean Kelly. If I had to make a list of segments from Unsolved Mysteries which I consider to be underrated and don't get nearly as much discussion as they should, this would be ranked near the top. I recall watching this segment on one occasion many years ago, but did not revisit it until very recently when I went through Season 9 of the show on Amazon Prime, and I must say, I had completely forgotten just how bizarre this case really is. It's rather unique in that the victim's actual death might have been nothing more than a tragic accident, but many of the events which occurred before and after Patrick was killed are a real head-scratcher. I also decided to feature this case because The Trail Went Cold is a Canadian-produced podcast, but it's been a while since we featured a Canadian mystery on the show. Technically, the brunt of this story takes place in Mexico while Patrick was a student at an American university, but he was a Canadian citizen, and the amount of jurisdictional red tape his mother has faced from these countries sounds like a real nightmare. So on this episode, we're going to attempt to piece together the events which led to Patrick's death. However, before we get started, just a brief reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play Music. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites, because that will help us garner more exposure. The Trail Went Cold also has its own PayPal account and a donate button on the website. If there's anyone out there who wants to make a donation, we would greatly appreciate it, and we'll be sure to give you a shout out on a future episode. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the bizarre unexplained death of Patrick Sean Kelly. Our story begins in 1996, and our central figure is 22-year-old Patrick Sean Kelly, a student at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. Patrick originally hails from Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, and was raised by his American-born single mother, Terry Kelly. Patrick was originally born into a First Nations group called the Blood Tribe, but placed in foster care when he was still a baby, and adopted by Terry when he was 18 months old. Patrick always had a passion for writing, and in 1993, he was accepted into the USC Film School undergraduate screenwriting division. He spent his next 3 years in the program and seemed to have bright prospects, as one of his instructors described him as a star on the rise. The final year-end project for his third semester involved writing a feature-length screenplay, and Patrick would receive an A on the assignment. On the evening of Friday, May 3rd, 1996, Patrick decided to celebrate by going out and partying with a friend named Michael Park before they returned to Patrick's dorm room to watch movies. The two friends parted ways when Michael left at around 3:45 a.m. on May 4th. The weekend went by, and Terry Kelly was surprised when she did not receive a phone call from Patrick on May 5th, as it was his custom to call his mother every Sunday night. During the next 2 days, Terry did not hear from her son and couldn't get a hold of him, so she called Michael and asked him to go check on Patrick in his room. Patrick was not there, but Michael noticed that his passport happened to be missing. However, Patrick's wallet, along with his bags and the rest of his clothing, were still in the room. Michael noticed an unplayed message on Patrick's answering machine and decided to listen to it, and it turned out to be a message from Patrick's bank asking him to call them. After Michael informed Terry about this, she called the bank and learned some unsettling news. Patrick's bank account had been overdrawn by $17 because of a number of ATM transactions which took place in Mexico over the weekend. The first transaction took place at 10:24 a.m. on Saturday, May 4th, when a $60 withdrawal was made from a convenience store ATM in San Clemente, which was located over an hour south from USC. The next ATM transaction took place over the border at 6:08 p.m. that evening, as $135 was withdrawn at a tourist area in Tijuana. At around 5 p.m. on Sunday, May 5th, 3 more ATM withdrawals totaling $114 were made from a Tijuana bank until Patrick's account was overdrawn. According to Michael, Patrick had never mentioned anything about taking a trip to Mexico that weekend, so these ATM transactions were a cause for great concern. Well, Terry attempted to report her son missing with the LAPD, and also contacted Canada's Department of Foreign Affairs, as well as their embassies in Mexico. But after not hearing from them in over a week, she decided to hire a private investigator named Doug Roth to look into things. Roth started out by visiting the convenience store in San Clemente, where Patrick's first ATM withdrawal was made. He was allowed to check the surveillance footage from the morning of May 4th, and it showed Patrick entering the store at 10:02 a.m. However, the footage also showed Patrick in the company of another young white male, and they appeared to be interacting until they left the store together. There would eventually be some speculation about who this young man might be, but we'll get back to that later. Roth's next step was to travel south to San Isidro, which was located next to the US-Mexico border. Since it was common for people to make short-term trips to Tijuana, there were a number of parking lots where tourists could leave their vehicles so they could walk across the border. Roth brought along a photograph of Patrick's car and started checking the parking lots, and he eventually found an attendant who recognized the vehicle. Sure enough, Patrick's car was parked in one of the lots near a back fence. The vehicle's exterior was now caked in mud, the rear license plate was loose, and there was damage to the front right bumper. When Roth looked inside, he noticed that the driver's seat was very close to the steering wheel, much closer than someone who was Patrick's size, 6'1", would have normally placed it. The radio was tuned to a Spanish-American station which Patrick was unlikely to have listened to, and there was also a cigarette butt in the ashtray, even though Patrick was not a smoker and never allowed people to smoke inside his car. Roth was also surprised to discover that the vehicle had not been in the parking lot the entire time Patrick was missing. According to the lot's records, it had originally been parked there on May 4th, but 11 days later, someone picked up the car and paid the $60 fee before driving away. Yet for reasons unknown, the car was returned to the lot the following day and parked in the exact same spot, where it would be discovered by Roth on May 20th. This left Roth absolutely perplexed, but the parking lot manager offered to take Patrick's photo and give it to his girlfriend in Tijuana, where she could circulate it and hopefully find someone who recognized him. Well, a few days later, there would finally be some answers. The lot manager's girlfriend eventually learned that Patrick's body was now lying in a Tijuana morgue. He was listed under the name Luis Rodriguez and was said to be buried in an unmarked grave. When Terry Kelly was notified, she traveled to the morgue on May 26th, and after viewing the victim's body, she conclusively identified him as her son. However, the authorities seemed unable to provide a straight answer about what actually happened to Patrick. They shared a number of conflicting stories with Terry, including that Patrick had been hit by a car, or that he was hit by a car while riding on a motorcycle, or that he was riding on a motorcycle as a passenger and fell off. Terry was even given 3 different causes of death, which included head trauma, multiple trauma, and septic shock. However, there were multiple witnesses who could provide a somewhat official version of what happened. At around 1 a.m. on May 5th, an American University student named Tony Wara was riding on his motorcycle with a passenger and heading east down Avenida Internacional, a 4-lane highway which runs through Tijuana along the U.S.-Mexico border. For this reason, the highway is notorious for fatalities, as it's not uncommon for pedestrians to be struck and killed when they attempt to cross the road and navigate through heavy traffic so they can climb over the security fences and cross the border illegally. Well, on this particular night, 2 pedestrians suddenly darted across the road in front of Tony Wara's motorcycle. The official version is that Wara crashed into one of the pedestrians, who turned out to be Patrick, but no one knows what happened to the second pedestrian. After the authorities were notified, Patrick was discovered to be unconscious and critically injured, so he was transferred to a local hospital. Since he was not carrying any identification, Patrick was officially listed as desconocido, which is Spanish for unknown. He never did regain consciousness and died from his injuries on May 11th. Tony Wara and his passenger were both treated for injuries in the hospital and recovered, and while Wara would verify that the motorcycle accident took place, he never did see the face of the person he hit, so he could not 100% confirm it was Patrick. 2 other eyewitnesses saw the accident and identified Patrick as the victim, though one of them would later admit he never saw the man's face and could not be 100% sure it was Patrick either. Anyway, more confusion ensued when a local newspaper published a photo of Patrick while he was unconscious in the hospital in hopes that someone would recognize him and come forward. Well, Patrick was initially identified as someone named Luis Rodriguez, but the real Luis Rodriguez's family would later view Patrick's body and confirm it wasn't him. In spite of this, Patrick was still listed under the name Luis Rodriguez in the morgue before his mother arrived to claim him. It seems that Patrick may have been misidentified because all the information about him in the official report was completely wrong. He was initially described as being 5'5", obese, approximately 27 years old, and wearing a blue t-shirt and white tennis shoes. In actuality, Patrick was 6'1", 200 pounds, 22 years old, and he was wearing a tan t-shirt and black shoes. Well, at least they only assumed that was his clothing, because he was seen wearing it in the convenience store surveillance footage from San Clemente. In actuality, Patrick's clothing had been destroyed after he arrived at the hospital. The Mexican authorities were satisfied that all of the injuries Patrick sustained had been caused by the motorcycle accident, but his mother did not buy it. When Doug Roth viewed Patrick's body, he noticed injuries to his face and upper body, which immediately made him suspect that Patrick had been the victim of a severe beating, as his injuries did not seem to be consistent with someone who had been struck by a motorcycle. Roth would also claim that a homicide division supervisor told him that the investigation into Patrick's death could be expedited if he was willing to pay for it, so there was an instant distrust of the Tijuana police. But even if Patrick's death was actually caused by the accident, there were still a number of troubling unanswered questions. Patrick's passport, car keys, and ATM card were never found, and the 3 ATM withdrawals which cleaned out his bank account occurred at 5 p.m. on May 5th, while Patrick was lying unconscious in the hospital. Even though security cameras existed at the bank where the withdrawals were made, Terry Kelly was not allowed to view the footage. Believe it or not, when she initially requested them, they provided her with videotapes from 2 years earlier in 1994. And of course, there were the records from the parking lot in San Isidro, which showed that someone had driven Patrick's car away and subsequently returned it 4 days after he died. And also, what about the other young man seen in the convenience store surveillance footage? Did he accompany Patrick to Mexico? And was he the second pedestrian seen running across Avenida Internacional? And if he was, what happened to him? Doug Roth put forward a theory that after arriving in Tijuana, Patrick crossed paths with some unsavory characters who stole his ATM card and beat him up, until he gave out his PIN number. Patrick then somehow managed to escape from them and was fleeing for his life when he attempted to run across Avenida Internacional and was hit by the motorcycle. When Terry Kelly transported Patrick's body back to the United States, she commissioned a private autopsy to be performed on him. The LA coroner's office refused to do their own autopsy at first until Terry paid for it out of her own pocket, but both autopsies came to the same conclusion, that Patrick's injuries did not support the idea that his death was caused by a motor vehicle accident. His spleen was not ruptured, his ribs were not broken, his skull was not fractured, and the coroner flat out told Terry that none of his injuries should have been fatal. Anyway, when Terry tried to get a new investigation launched into her son's death, she ran into a nightmare of jurisdictional red tape, as Patrick was a Canadian citizen who had been living in the US and was killed after crossing the border into Mexico. Canada's Department of Foreign Affairs told Terry that since Patrick's death took place on Mexican soil, the Mexican authorities technically had jurisdiction and there was nothing they could do. And unfortunately, the Tijuana police seemed uninterested in treating Patrick's case as anything more than an accident. In the official report, the lead police operative wrote, quote, "This was not a homicide. That is a figment of the private investigator's imagination. He is putting ideas into the family's head to make money." End quote. In fact, they even hinted to Canadian diplomats that Patrick may have been involved in narcotics trafficking. While this likely wasn't true, the implication seemed to be that if Terry continued to stir things up, the Tijuana authorities would publicly smear Patrick's name and brand him as a drug dealer. While the LAPD would not perform an official investigation into Patrick's death, they did agree to do some forensic work on his car since it was left behind in the parking lot in San Isidro and technically never crossed over the border. They found what appeared to be blood spatters on the driver's side door, but refused to test it because of jurisdictional issues since Patrick's body was discovered in Tijuana. Terry also contacted Mexico's National Human Rights Commission and asked them to look into the case. They were highly critical of the original police investigation into Patrick's death and recommended a new investigation, but it doesn't look like this ever led anywhere. There would also be one very odd postscript to this story. If you watch the Unsolved Mystery segment about this case on Amazon Prime, you'll notice that the section about the young man on the convenience store surveillance footage has been edited out, and there's probably a reason for that. When the case was originally aired on the show in February of 1997, it was mentioned that the LAPD believed the guy in the footage might be a former USC student named Matthew Steparik, who also happened to be wanted on unrelated charges at that time. Even though no one could be certain that he and Patrick actually knew each other, they apparently had a mutual friend. Well, Matthew Steparik and his family were watching the Unsolved Mysteries episode in Toronto and were quite shocked to see this. Sadly, Matthew suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, and since he was being treated in a Toronto psychiatric hospital at the time Patrick was killed, there was no way he could have been the man in the surveillance footage. Matthew became very distraught and confused by this, and the following day, without telling his family, he took his mother's car and decided to drive to the United States. He hoped to meet up with the LAPD and get everything straightened out, but unfortunately, since he had unrelated charges pending against him from years earlier, Matthew was arrested once he crossed the border and would spend the next 5 months in a Los Angeles jail. Matthew had been wanted on charges of breaking and entering, stalking, and attempted rape, as a former girlfriend had accused Matthew of attacking her while he was attending USC. However, Matthew had a pretty concrete alibi supporting his innocence, as he had been vacationing at a Club Med resort in St. Lucia with his brother at the time this so-called attack allegedly took place. Since it was also clear that Matthew had no involvement in Patrick's disappearance, he was released in July and returned to Canada, but since Matthew did not receive the proper treatment for his schizophrenia while incarcerated, the whole ordeal took a major toll on him, and he attempted suicide only hours after arriving in Toronto, though he did ultimately survive. So understandably, all mentions of Matthew Steparik would be edited out of all subsequent re-airings of the Unsolved Mystery segment, and his story turned out to be a completely unrelated tragedy connected to Patrick's case. If you heard my episode about the Tommy Burkett case a few months ago, You might remember me mentioning a website that Tommy's parents used to run called Parents Against Corruption and Cover-Up. The Burketts allowed parents who lost their children under suspicious circumstances to share their stories on the website, and Terry Kelly was one of them. But unfortunately, there have been no further developments in the case in over 20 years, so the exact circumstances of Patrick's death, along with the identity of the young man who accompanied him to Tijuana, remain unclear. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. But before we continue, we would like to take a moment to talk to you about our sponsor, Wink, as we are very excited that they are fans of the show. We often share some very creepy stories on this podcast, so sipping a nice glass of wine while you listen to us would be a great way to help you relax. Wink is targeting a new generation of wine drinkers who want to do away with the pretense and simply enjoy reasonably priced, great wine. Wink custom tailors wines to the taste of the individual consumer and delivers 3 bottles of wine each month to your doorstep for $39 plus free shipping. When you visit Wink and take their 20-second palate profile quiz, you'll get instant wine recommendations based on your unique profile. The price point for most wines is $13, so by signing up with Wink, you are getting your first bottle for free. Wink is offering our audience members who are over 21 and live in the US a $20 credit, plus free shipping on your first order of 4 bottles of wine as a new member of Wink. Your wine delivery will be branded Wink. Wink is the wine club associated with Wink. Just the other night, I enjoyed a nice 2016 bottle of Pacifica Cabernet Sauvignon, a crowd-pleasing red wine which was produced in California with aromas of clove and dark fruit. It also has tasting notes of clove, black cherry, and oak, showcasing the classic California styles for a new generation of wine enthusiasts. It embodies the bold, pioneering spirit of the California landscape and those who call it home. Just pop it open 20 minutes before serving to get the full effect, and it goes great with burgers and veggies. Like I said earlier, this particular brand of wine would be an ideal companion for you while listening to our podcast. So to receive a $20 credit and free shipping on 4 bottles of wine on your first order, go to trywink.com/cold. That's trywink.com/cold. trywinc.com/cold. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of this episode. Well, as you probably know, I've covered a number of stories on this podcast about parents who were unable to find answers in the suspicious deaths of their children. But this has definitely got to be one of the most frustrating, as Terry Kelly found herself trapped in the bureaucratic nightmare of having to deal with the authorities in not 1, not 2, but 3 separate countries, and none of them came across particularly well. And when coupled with the side story about the ordeal Matthew Stepark had to go through, this is not exactly an episode which will restore your faith in law enforcement. Of course, it probably won't surprise any of you to learn that Tijuana has always been known for having a widespread problem with police corruption, and it's one of the last places you'd ever want to become the victim of a crime. One of the obstacles against seeking justice is that the details about Patrick's actual death are so murky. If the official version is correct, and Patrick was killed because he was struck by a motorcycle while crossing the highway, then technically his death was an accident, and the motorcyclist, Tony Wara, is definitely not at fault. But if Patrick was beaten up and robbed beforehand, and died as a result of being chased by someone, then figuring out how to prosecute anyone for their role in his death might be pretty complicated, and that's assuming, of course, that Patrick's death was actually a result of the accident. But whatever happened, the biggest mysteries in this case are, what was Patrick doing in Mexico to begin with? Did someone else take the trip with him? And how did Patrick wind up in a situation where he felt the need to sprint across a dangerous highway? I think one reason this story really sticks out for me is because I can see a lot of myself in Patrick. We both have similar interests, as I also happened to take screenwriting when I attended college, so Patrick seems like the type of guy I probably would have hung out with if we went to the same school together. Patrick also apparently had a tendency to take off on solo trips by himself to places like Las Vegas, as he claimed it helped provide inspiration for his screenwriting, and that's actually the type of thing I would sometimes do when I was his age. On the surface, Patrick deciding to take off on a weekend trip to Tijuana doesn't seem that unusual. It's very common for students in California to cross the border to go partying in Tijuana because it has much looser drinking laws and alcohol is cheaper. In fact, Unsolved Mysteries also featured a similar segment about the suspicious 1998 death of a young man named Jason Artis, who got very intoxicated during a trip to Tijuana and became separated from his brother before his battered body was discovered on a nearby road. Even though the local authorities felt that the official cause of death was a hit-and-run accident, there was a lot of suspicion that Jason might have crossed paths with some corrupt police officers who beat him to death. So the exact same thing could have easily happened to Patrick. He traveled to Tijuana for a good time, crossed paths with the wrong people, and wound up dead. During this particular semester, Patrick had sworn off drinking alcohol because of a binge drinking incident at a fraternity party had landed him in the hospital the previous fall. However, because the semester was now over, it's possible Patrick decided to cut loose and go party. But the thing which left everyone perplexed is that not only did Patrick not tell anyone about his trip to Tijuana, but he may have traveled there with a male companion whom no one else has ever recognized. By the sound of things, this was probably just going to be a short-term trip, as Patrick left his wallet and all his other possessions behind, and only seemed to take his passport and ATM card. Since he never mentioned anything to his mother, it seems like he was planning to return the following day in time to make his annual Sunday night phone call to her. But while it's understandable that Patrick might not want to tell his mother he was planning to go party in Tijuana, it is pretty odd that he wouldn't say anything to one of his best friends, Michael Park. They hung out together until around 3:45 a.m., and Patrick left only a few hours later, yet he never told Michael about his plans. Now, because of the unfortunate incident with Matthew Steparik, there is a lot of controversy about the unidentified young man seen alongside Patrick in the convenience store surveillance footage from San Clemente, so I do have to acknowledge the possibility that this might be a red herring. Yes, Patrick and this man appear to be interacting and leaving the store together, but the footage isn't exactly high quality, and there's no sound. For all we know, the other guy could have just been a stranger whom Patrick bumped into inside the store and struck up a conversation with. Hell, maybe the guy was a stranger who asked Patrick for a ride, and that's how he wound up getting into trouble. But if Patrick and this guy were friends, and left on this trip together, this opens up a lot of questions about how they met in the first place, especially since Patrick's regular circle of friends were unable to recognize him. Now, I hate to make assumptions like this, but I don't really know anything about Patrick's love life, so I guess it is possible that Patrick could have been carrying on a secret relationship with this guy, and that's why he was so reluctant to tell anybody else about him. Of course, that's all just speculation on my part, but it takes over 2.5 hours to drive from Los Angeles to Tijuana, and that's not the type of trip you would make with just anybody. One of the main reasons to believe that Patrick and this guy did travel to Tijuana together are the eyewitness accounts of a second person running across the highway alongside Patrick when he was struck with the motorcycle. In the confusion, no one knows what happened to this second pedestrian, but it would not surprise me at all if he was the guy from the surveillance video, and both he and Patrick ran into trouble together. So the first part of Patrick's journey does make sense. He left his car in the parking lot in San Isidro, and then walked over the border to Tijuana, which is what many people do when they're only planning to be in the city for a short time. I'd say that Doug Ross' theory about what happened after that is probably correct. At some point during the evening, Patrick and his male companion crossed paths with some unsavory characters who got a hold of his ATM card and beat Patrick up in order to force him to reveal his PIN number. Patrick and his companion were probably running for their lives when they attempted to cross Avenida Internacional, and Patrick was struck by the motorcycle. Now, we know this highway is often used by people who want to climb over the adjacent security fences in order to cross the border illegally, which is why it's fairly common for people to be fatally struck and killed there by oncoming traffic. While it would be unusual to find a tourist attempting to cross the highway like that, you have to remember that Patrick's passport was never found, so it's reasonable to assume that whoever took his ATM card probably took his passport as well. Without it, Patrick would not have been able to cross the border the legal way, which is why he might have figured that sprinting across Avenida Internacional and scaling the fences was his only option for returning to the US. Of course, if Patrick was desperate enough to try something like that, then this would imply that he didn't feel comfortable going to the authorities, which makes me wonder if the people who beat him up and stole his ATM card might have been police officers. It's no secret that Tijuana, and Mexico in general, have always had major problems with corrupt police officers extorting tourists by threatening to arrest them and throw them in jail unless they hand over their money. In fact, Tony Wara, the American motorcyclist who hit Patrick, had to deal with this himself. Wara claimed that immediately after regaining consciousness in the hospital, police officers literally lifted him from his bed and took him to jail. He had to pay over $1,300 in bail and administrative fees and another $2,500 to get his motorcycle back. If police officers were responsible for what happened to Patrick, then this would explain why there are so many conflicting reports about the circumstances of his death. So let's go under the assumption that Patrick was not actually killed in the motorcycle accident and was murdered in another fashion, such as being beaten to death. We know that an accident involving Tony Wara's motorcycle did occur, but no one can say with 100% certainty that Patrick was the actual victim. So imagine a scenario in which someone else was fatally struck by a motorcycle, but the police orchestrated a cover-up to make it look like it was Patrick. Granted, this sounds pretty over the top, but remember, 2 autopsies performed in the US concluded that Patrick's injuries were not consistent with a motor vehicle accident. One of the most confusing aspects of this story is how Patrick was incorrectly identified as someone named Luis Rodriguez until Rodriguez's family saw his body and confirmed it was not him. Okay, so if this Luis Rodriguez guy existed, then what actually happened to him? There doesn't seem to be any follow-up details on this part of the story. Did it turn out Rodriguez was alive all along, or did he die too? It seems like one of the reasons Rodriguez's family thought Patrick might be him was because he was initially described as being 27 years old, 5'5", and obese, so I have to assume that this fits the real Luis Rodriguez's description. I know the authorities claim that all the inaccurate information reported about Patrick was an honest mistake, but what if Luis Rodriguez was the real victim who was killed in the motorcycle accident? If the police murdered Patrick, then they could have fudged the paperwork and made it look like he was the accident victim. But if that's the case, then what actually happened to Luis Rodriguez's body? If Rodriguez was confirmed to be alive and well after this happened, then you can completely discount this theory, but trying to get a concrete answer about this would probably be impossible. So while there might have been a cover-up involved, it's also equally as plausible that the whole situation was nothing more than just plain old-fashioned sloppiness and incompetence. Of course, one fact which is indisputable is that someone used Patrick's ATM card to clean out his bank account while he was comatose in the hospital, and they wouldn't have been able to do that without his PIN number. During the Unsolved Mystery segment, they interview a very disinterested-looking assistant DA from Tijuana, and he tries to write off the situation as Patrick having given his ATM card and PIN number to a friend, who subsequently used it to make all those withdrawals. But that notion is pretty ridiculous, as how many of you folks out there are close enough to someone to just give them your ATM PIN number? No, I'd say this definitely lends credence to the theory that someone forced Patrick to reveal his PIN. However, the one part of this case which truly baffles me is the disappearance and reappearance of Patrick's car from the parking lot in San Isidro 4 days after he died. We know Patrick's car keys were never found, so it's plausible that the same person who took his ATM card could have taken his keys. It is odd that they would wait a full 10 days after Patrick was hospitalized in order to take his car, but maybe it just took them that long to figure out where he had parked it. But for the life of me, I just cannot figure out why they would return the car to the lot the following day. We know that $114 was withdrawn from Patrick's account while he was in the hospital, and judging from his ATM transactions the day before, Patrick might have also had around $200 in cash on him when his card was taken. When you factor in that $60 in fees had to be paid to drive Patrick's car out of the parking lot, that's not a large take. They could have made a chunk of money by selling his vehicle, so I cannot reconcile why they would return it to the same lot again and just leave it there. Quite frankly, if Doug Roth had not found the car in the lot, then I don't believe they would have been able to track down Patrick's body in the morgue before he was buried in an unmarked grave, and he would probably still be considered a missing person today. So where exactly was the car during the one day it was gone from the lot? I've tried to account for the possibility that maybe the parking lot's records were wrong and the car didn't actually leave the lot on May 15th. However, since the seat was adjusted, the radio was tuned to a Spanish-American station, and there was a cigarette butt in the ashtray, it seems very likely that someone else besides Patrick was driving that car at some point. There was also a lot of mud on the vehicle's exterior, and when you consider that Patrick could have made the entire trip from Los Angeles to Tijuana on the interstate, that car had to have been driven somewhere else at some point. The discovery of apparent blood spatters on the driver's side door opens up more unanswered questions. Even though it was never tested, I have my doubts that the blood belonged to Patrick, since it seems like his troubles didn't start until after he had already parked the car and walked across the border into Mexico. I just don't see how Patrick's blood can wind up there 10 days after he was hospitalized, but then, whose blood is it? It's reasonable to assume that something unsavory happened in that car during the day it was off the lot, but if that's the case, then why not just get rid of the vehicle somewhere, rather than return it? Of course, the alternate explanation is that Patrick's unidentified male companion got a hold of his car keys, and he was the one who drove away in the vehicle. If the second pedestrian seen running alongside Patrick was his friend, and he managed to escape, then maybe he eventually made it back to the US and got a hold of Patrick's car. I know the car wasn't driven away until 10 days later, but maybe it took him that long to sneak across the border. But that wouldn't account for why he would decide to return the car to the lot the following day. It seems like Patrick was this guy's transportation to get to Tijuana, so how was he planning to get back home? Overall, I just cannot figure out what the deal with the car is, so it's definitely the most inexplicable aspect of this story. The big key to this mystery is figuring out if Patrick did travel to Tijuana with someone else, and if so, what happened to him. If this guy managed to get out of Mexico and make it back home, then he has obviously kept the circumstances of Patrick's death a secret for over 20 years. That would lend credence to the idea that he and Patrick were carrying on a secret relationship nobody knew about, or that they got involved in something they weren't supposed to after they arrived in Tijuana. But it's also possible that whoever beat up Patrick eventually caught up with his friend and made him disappear. When you see how close Patrick came to becoming an unidentified victim buried in an unmarked grave, the very same thing could have happened to this guy. However, if he is dead, then it doesn't seem like he's ever been reported missing, or if he was, no one has made the connection between him and Patrick's case. This guy might have a family somewhere who've been looking for him for the past 2 decades, but just don't have any inkling that he traveled all the way to Mexico. The other frightening scenario is that the guy in the surveillance video is responsible for everything that happened to Patrick, and that he lured him down to Mexico, beat him up, and stole his ATM card. But given the amount of shady activity involving the authorities in this case, I'm sure there's more to it than that. If I had to lean in one direction, it's my guess that Patrick and his companion took a trip to Tijuana together, but both wound up becoming victims after they crossed paths with the wrong people. Since there are hints of a deliberate cover-up, it would not surprise me at all if these people were affiliated with law enforcement. Anyway, if you're a true crime follower, I'm sure you've heard more than a few stories about people who have gone missing or wound up dead under suspicious circumstances while visiting a foreign country, and you'll know just how nightmarish these situations can be for their families. It seems like the Canadian, American, and Mexican authorities all let Terry Kelly down. Terry has claimed that an LAPD officer told her that she was probably not going to receive any assistance because of the North American Free Trade Agreement, aka NAFTA. At the time, NAFTA had only been in effect for a few years, and it's possible no one wanted to rock the boat and potentially jeopardize it. On the Parents Against Corruption and Cover-Up website, Terry wrote, and I quote, Our governments are not prepared to upset a U.S.-Canadian trading partner over the life of a 22-year-old with no political or economic importance." End quote. Sadly, it doesn't look like this case has received any media coverage at all for over 20 years, and I have no idea what Terry Kelly is up to today. Her son had a very bright future which was stripped away from him, and to this day, no one is completely certain about how exactly he died, so she deserves to know the full truth about what happened. At the end of every episode, I always advised anyone with information about these unsolved cases to contact the appropriate authorities, but in this particular case, I'm not sure it would do much good, since the Mexican authorities are the ones with jurisdiction, and they seem unwilling to do anything. I think the only real chance this case has for at least some sort of resolution is if the unidentified young man who traveled to Mexico with Patrick is still alive and out there somewhere, and were to come forward and share the full story about what happened. While I'm not sure anyone would be prosecuted for their role in Patrick's death at this point, at least his mother would receive some form of closure. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave a comment or send me an email at robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. We also have a bunch of new donors to thank this week, including Samuel, Gabrielle, Ostina, Alfonsina, and an extra special thanks to a listener named Greg for a really generous donation, so thank you very much to all of you. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play Music. We also have a Facebook discussion group, so if you feel like discussing the podcast or the cases we feature with myself or your fellow listeners, feel free to join, and I'll approve your entry into the group ASAP. I also wanted to mention again that I will be representing The Trail Went Cold by appearing on Podcast Row at CrimeCon, which is being held at the Gaylord Opryland Hotel in Nashville from May 4th to the 6th. I met some of you fine folks at CrimeCon last year, and I would love to have the opportunity to meet many more of you folks at this year's event. So if you're planning to attend CrimeCon and need to purchase tickets, you can receive a 10% discount by using our podcast promo code. Just visit crimecon.com and get 10% off by entering the promo code TTWC. That's TTWC. Like I mentioned earlier, we also have a donate button on our website, so if you're feeling generous and want to express your appreciation for all the hard work we put into this podcast, we'd be extremely grateful. So have yourself a good week, and join me next Wednesday for a brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.